Great. Well, thanks very much, Libby, for inviting me along to come and speak to everyone tonight. It's great to see so many people come along to listen as well. So I'm going to be speaking about underwater fluorescence that I found in my dives in Scotland. So this obviously shares many species and similar habitats to Northern Ireland as well. So I'm going to start with a brief intro just about myself and how I got into fluo photography, and then a bit about the background of fluorescence. I'll look at some of the equipment I use, and then I'll have plenty of pictures and some video of all the different species that I found to fluoresce over the last few years. So I'm based in Scotland, near Dundee on the east coast. I work in science, in crop science. I'm a plant pathologist at the James Hutton Institute in Dundee and work primarily on potato lake blight. So I'm not trained in marine biology, but I do have a huge interest in marine life and the underwater world. So I've spent a lot of time sort of learning about underwater species and habitats. I am a Seasearch surveyor, although I'm a bit ashamed to admit I haven't done many forms recently. So sorry, Ian, and you're here. So I started diving in 2010. Most of my diving is in Scotland, sort of around the west coast. And from where I am, it's only a couple of hours to get to most of the most dive sea locks, like Loch Fyne, Loch Weavin, around the Oban area and Loch Long, etc. There's also great diving on the east coast of Scotland and the Moray coast in the north, although I do probably neglect these areas, to be fair, and spend most of the time on the west coast. So I got into underwater photography in 2012, and the main reason is probably the same as most people who get into underwater photography, is just to capture all the amazing marine life and the underwater world in general that we see on our dives that most people don't get to see. And around about the same time as I was starting to get into underwater photography, I became aware of underwater fluorescence, and that just completely caught my attention at the time. So fluorescence in marine species has been known for some time, so since the 60s and early 70s. A very basic explanation is that certain proteins and minerals and compounds that are present in some marine life and different species will absorb sort of high energy wavelengths of light, which are around 450 nanometers of its blue light or 395 nanometers of its UV light, and then they'll re-emit this light at a lower energy, longer wavelength, which is your greens, reds, yellows, and purples, which is what we'll see as fluorescence. That's obviously a very simplified explanation as to what's going on. And some of these proteins have been identified, such as green fluorescence protein, which was first sort of isolated from jellyfish in the early 60s. And it's become one of the most important tools in contemporary bioscience as well. So I was already familiar with this from my work too. So Nightsea founder Charles Mazel, this guy here, he began building his own underwater ultraviolet lights in the mid-70s, and then he later went on to develop the Nightsea light range with Light in Motion. And on the Light in Motion dive Facebook page, there's a really nice video of Charles doing a live stream, sort of an interactive talk back in 2020, where he talks about his experience developing lights and sort of experimenting with underwater fluorescence, and that's what this clip's actually from. So that's well worth a watch if you're interested in that. The lights that are recommended to be used to excite underwater fluorescence have changed from the UV range to blue light range, as this was found to give sort of better results. So Charles Mazel from Nightsea, Lynn Miner from Fire Dive Gear, who also produces lights and filters, and Horst Grunz, this guy from Germany. They've posted lots of detail on their websites, basically to explain fluorescence and how blue light works better than UV light for most things. That's not to say UV light doesn't work. It does, and it can be very useful for certain subjects. So when I first became aware of underwater fluorescence, I started to research it, and yeah, I found it really interesting. And at that time, with very few exceptions, the underwater fluorescence dives, or UV night dives, as many places still call them, were more widely known from tropical seas, sort of coral reefs, places like that. But there was very little evidence at the time to show this had been explored in any extent in temperate or colder seas. So I was curious to see which British species or would fluoresce that we can see on our dives here. So after experimenting with different sort of filters and lights and gradually upgrading my camera gear, I kind of started experimenting really around 2016. So just to look at some of the gear that I use. So camera in the middle there with the housing, it's just this compact Canon G7X Mark III. And actually most of the images and video in this talk were taken with the Mark II version of this camera, which I've been using for about 6 years until just very recently. And I've used a different range of lights over the years. The first ones I got were these Light in Motion Gobi Night Sea lights, which are kind of smaller, cheaper lights. I had these since about 2015 and I still use them. They're great for a spotting light or to use for macro because they've got a nice narrow beam. These fire dive gear made by Lynott and Rift Dive. These lights are really bright and a big step up from the Gobi lights. And I also have a pair of Light in Motion Solar Night Sea lights, and I probably use these most often now. All of these lights have a wavelength of blue light at around 450 nanometers, and they use blue LEDs together with a special filter on the front of the light, which gives the most optimum wavelength for sort of exciting the fluorescence. So as well as the lights, the other sort of essential component for viewing fluorescence or capturing it on camera is a yellow barrier filter. And the purpose of this is to block sort of the excess reflected blue light from the subject that you're shining the lights at, so that you can just see, the fluorescence rather than all the blue light kind of covering everything. So a couple of different mask filters, a Light in Motion filter and a fire dive gear one. This one has a really handy Velcro holder that you can put your mask strap in, so you don't have to worry about losing the barrier filter when you lift it off your mask to see things normally. And also have a range of 67mm threaded barrier filters that screw onto the camera housing. And these all work slightly differently. So there's the yellow 12 filter, which blocks out pretty much all of the blue reflected light. So all you're seeing is the fluorescence. And this can look quite nice for some subjects, but I think it is quite nice to see some blue left in the image as well. So the fire dive gear filter lets the most of the blue light, not most of the blue light, but the most from these filters back through. And the Night Sea filter is kind of somewhere in between the two. It is kind of personal taste. I like some blue left in the image for most subjects. It makes for a bit more interesting images. But again, it's kind of an aesthetic thing. I also have a couple of macro wet lenses, which also have a threaded sort of end on them, so I can use these filters with the macro lenses, which quite a few of the images in this talk are taken with the macro lens. And then you also get these strobe excitation filters. So this will convert the white light from the strobe into sort of the optimum wavelength for viewing fluorescence as well. So when I'm capturing fluorescence, I generally aim for night dives or sea lock dives, perhaps during the winter, where it can be quite dark below the sort of silty freshwater layer. Anyone that dives all year round, sort of in Scotland on the west coast, probably experienced this as well. It can be like night dives during the day sometimes, which is great if you're trying to see fluo stuff. So obviously it can be a bit trickier during the summer with much longer days, lighter evenings, where it doesn't get dark till sort of 10 o'clock at night. Because for the shots I want to get, I do prefer no or very little ambient light. So if you have too much ambient light, this can bleed into your image and create a sort of unwanted haze or dampen the fluorescence, which isn't ideal. Of course, sometimes if the subject has very bright fluorescence, it's possible to eliminate ambient light by using your camera exposure settings. This is just to have a look at some of my earlier shots when I was first starting out with fluorescence. So they're not the best pictures, but these were taken around 2015 and then later 2016. So when I started to get these, it was really exciting to confirm that there were indeed species that would fluoresce in our seas. So I kind of suspected that cup corals and Cerianthus tube anemones would for us. But what was really interesting on the dive where I saw these anemones was there's lots of hermit crabs with the cloaking anemones, which fluoresced, which was a big surprise. I wasn't expecting to find that. And then later, once I got a slightly better camera, I could get the first images of fireworks anemones fluorescent and light bulb tunicates. So after I'd started to get a couple of images on these early dives, it was obviously quite excited for species that would fluoresce in our seas. So over the next few years, I've experimented with better lights, different filters, and learning a lot about trying to capture underwater fluorescence. So I had always suspected that cup corals would fluoresce, and they're in fact one of, or probably they are the brightest fluorescent subjects that I've found so far. This one is just an example of the same cup coral taken with normal lights and then fluorescent underneath the blue lights. They're quite an easy subject to take these kind of comparison shots with because, well, they don't move. It can take a bit of time to kind of switch lights on, switch other lights off, excuse me, or add and remove barrier filters, and other things don't like to hang around while you faff around with gear quite so much. And this one's just to show an example of the difference that the barrier filter can make. So this is a cup coral taken under white light, and then the same coral taken with blue lights, but with no barrier filter. So you can see a bit more fluorescence starting to show, but a lot of it is getting washed out by the excess blue light, and the blue light looks very strong in the image. And then the same cup coral taken again with blue lights, but with the yellow 12 filter, which removes basically all of the blue light. So you're seeing a lot more fluorescence there. But I still think a little bit of blue left in the image would make for a nicer sort of aesthetically pleasing image, and would show a bit more of the structure of the coral rather than just sort of monochrome green and black, which is why in recent years I've sort of favoured other barrier filters. So as I've seen on sort of my earlier dives, I kind of suspected that these Cerianthus anemones would fluoresce. After seeing images of similar tube anemones from different locations sort of around the world fluorescent, and they still continue to be one of my favourite subjects to photograph, as they can show a huge variation in the colours and different patterns. And this is the same when it comes to their fluorescence as well. And they do look a bit like mini fireworks anemones, especially when they're fluorescent. And this is one of the images taken on a night dive in Loch Long last year, and it shows some of the different patterns kind of all together. This is a nice congregation of anemones found on a night dive, in Loch Long last year. So there was always one species that was pretty much at the top of the list for me to try this technique with, and that was the fireworks anemones. So they're already very impressive creatures, and anyone who's dived with them will know that there's a huge variation in their sort of colorations and patterns that they show. And this is also true for their fluorescence patterns. And the patterns that they show underneath the blue lights don't always necessarily match with what's shown under normal light. And I found this to be true for quite a few different species. And this is just a few more examples of the variation in the patterns of fluorescent fireworks anemones. So some will have very bright inner tentacles, others, the inner tentacles just won't fluoresce at all. And some will have very brightly fluorescent tips on the tentacles, and others will just have spots or bands on them. So there can be a big difference. And this is one of my favourite images, taken again in Loch Long on a night dive. I think it was 2021. This was using the fire dive gear strobe filter and barrier filter. So while I was first researching underwater fluorescence, I came across the work of American scientist David Gruber. So him and his group in 2016 published their work on fluorescent cat shark species from the Eastern Pacific and Western Atlantic. I thought, well, if their cat sharks will fluoresce, then surely ours will as well, and maybe other similar species would too. So I finally got to try this out in March 2015 and collected what I think might have been the first images of cat sharks fluorescing in the UK. Not actually confirmed that, so I'm not totally sure. And these images are much more recent, taken in 2020 and 2022. These are using, some of them are taken with different lights and different filters. So interestingly, with the cat sharks, I found that the younger, smaller sharks fluoresce much brighter than the adults. And I have also seen variation between the adults as well, but not had a chance to check whether it's a difference between sexes or if it's just a sort of general difference between the adult sharks. So after finding that our own cat shark did fluoresce, I was curious to see if other similar species, such as skates, would as well. And I was pleased to find out that they did. This center image was one of the first that I was able to capture. That was in Loch Leven back in 2019. And the rest were taken over sort of the next few years after that. I always find it really interesting with skates, as well as many other species, that the fluorescence patterns that they show underneath the blue lights don't really match with the patterns in the normal light. And that's especially true for this small ray that showed these weird wavy patterns that you just couldn't see under normal lights. And this small ray was one of my favourite ones that was taken in Loch Leven on a night dive in January last year. One of the first things that first brought my attention to underwater fluorescence was there was a BBC series back in 2012. It's called Britain's Secret Seas, and they had a little section of a night dive that they'd filmed at St Abbs on the east coast of Scotland, where they had blue lights and they were showing these the light bulb tunicates fluorescent, and that was kind of what sort of first gave me the idea to try this out and to look for other species. So they're still one of the favourite species of mine to try and photograph, especially with the macro lens. But I've also found other tunicates that can fluoresce, like these nice gas mantle squirts as well, where they have a lot of the different sort of yellow flecking in them and the gas mantle shape inside where they get their name, which also fluoresces nicely. So all the species I've shown you so far are ones that I kind of had some idea that they would fluoresce. But not to say that finding them fluorescent isn't great, and it's been really rewarding to see them, and it still is when I find them. But just going to go through some of the sort of species that were a real surprise to me. I didn't expect to fluoresce at all. The first lot is crustaceans, such as hermit crabs, and squat lobsters, and even barnacles. These caught me by surprise on that first night dive in Loch Melfort back in 2015 with the hermit crabs with the cloak anemones. I think what's nice about hermit crabs is they often have different things growing on their shells, so either hydroids or sort of algae, which show up interesting colours underneath the blue lights, or even barnacles like this one that looks particularly nice with all of the barnacles waving its arms around, glowing brightly on its shell. And I really like how the little cloak anemone hermit crabs look with the glowing cloak anemones as well. They can be very bright. And other crustaceans also look really cool, or even quite menacing underneath the blue light, such as these long-clawed squat lobsters, which are always quite feisty when you find them on a dive. And these spiny squat lobsters. This one was particularly bright. I found that in Loch Long on a night dive last year. And usually these guys will scoot away, disappear really quickly upside down on a rock as soon as you even lift your camera towards them. But this one hung around for me to get a few pictures, so I was quite surprised about that. It just kind of stood there out in the open while I took a few images. Maybe it was just showing off its fluorescence before it decided to move away. So there's many Cnidaria species that fluoresce. There's fireworks anemones, burrowing anemones, snake locks, beadlet anemones, and jewel anemones, which I've not shown here actually. So I was also keen to try this out on other Cnidarias such as sea pens. So these phosphorescent sea pens, I mean, they're always a favourite subject of mine to photograph anyway, just because they look quite cool just in the mud, and especially when there's quite a lot of them together. And I was really pleased to find that they do also fluoresce, and really quite nicely. And again, there's a lot of variation between individuals. So some of them will have really brightly fluorescent polyps, like this one, and others will have really bright inhalant polyps on the peduncle, the sort of spine bit at the back, and other ones will have no fluorescence on these parts, but just the polyps. So it does vary a lot between different individuals. And top knots were another really nice surprise when I found that they fluoresced really quite brightly as well. And there seems to be a huge variation again between different individuals. So these are all Ekstrom's top knots, but I've also seen fluorescence in common top knots and the smaller Norwegian species as well. I don't have any decent pictures of them yet, unfortunately. But when seeing these top knots flash so brightly, it does something I've not really spoke about yet, is makes you wonder about the purpose, or if there is any purpose to underwater species having the ability to fluoresce, or is it just a sort of accident that happens to be there, or can other species actually see this perhaps as a result of blue light being the last wavelength that's filtered out from the sunlight by the sea? I mean, our eyes are pretty crap compared to others in the animal kingdom, and we can only see this with the help of really bright lights. And so I don't think it's completely unreasonable to assume that other species perhaps could see this. But when you look at these two top knots here, so this one and this one, when I first approached them using my sort of white light, they were both really well camouflaged on the sort of silty rock they were sitting on. But then as soon as I shone the blue lights on them, they completely stood out against the background. So it does make you wonder if there would be any benefit for them to stand out so much when they're obviously trying to be camouflaged. And another thing that was really unexpected was fluorescent nudibranchs. So I first seen nudies fluorescent was doing a night dive on the wreck of the Breeder, which is near over on the west coast, back in 2017. So I was using a mask filter on that dive as well as lots of really bright fluorescent cop corals. We'd see this occasional other really bright glowing green blob, and it wasn't until I looked a bit closer that they were nudibranchs. So it was this same species that's shown here. I did take some photos at the time, but they weren't great. So these pictures were actually taken just last year, and this is a comparison of the same individual taken with a strobe and then with the blue lights, just to show the difference in the fluorescence from the normal light. And this one's actually eating a small plumosine enemy as well. I should also mention a buddy of mine, Alistair Odell. He takes amazing pictures of lots of different nudie species fluorescent too. So I definitely recommend checking out his Instagram and Twitter if you want to see more fluorescent nudie. And so just a couple more images of the same species again. These were taken from Loch Long and Loch Crieran. And this also kind of makes you think of what the purpose would it serve the nudies to stand out so brightly from the substrate if other species could see this. And another nudie species that looks really nice under the blue lights are these sea lemons. So they have a really textured mantle and show some amazing colors and patterns underneath the blue light. And the last image is just a nice fluorescent nudie butt and gills. So I mentioned earlier, I did like to collect some video as well. So the final slide has just got a short compilation video to show you. It does have music, so maybe just turn it down if it's too loud. I'm not quite sure how loud it's going to be when it starts.
think we're all being nice and shy, but I think everybody's going, wow, when watching these videos and photos. Stunning.
Thanks very much, everyone, for listening. I hope you did find this interesting. If you want to see some more images or video of mine, you can check out my Instagram or YouTube or my website. And unless you're interested in seeing more UK underwater fluorescence shots, I would highly recommend having a look at the work of some of these photographers as well, who are also capturing really nice underwater fluorescence images and video from the UK. So I'll happily take any questions if anyone has any.
We have some questions from the chat. So just to be fair to those that posed the questions first, could we start with those? Henrietta, you asked about the relationship of green fluorescent protein extracted from jellyfish to bacterial fluorescein. I'm not quite sure what you wanted to ask. Do you maybe want to say it out loud? Henrietta, not sure if she can hear us. But James, do you have any comments about specific proteins they're talking about while you're taking photographs?
Yeah, I'm not totally sure if they've all even been identified other than GFP from certain species. As far as I know, I don't think all of the other proteins or minerals or compounds have even been identified in other marine life. So I couldn't really comment on bacterial fluorescence, I'm afraid.
Thanks very much. And then Vera, you had asked for the name of the fluorescent nudibranchs. Did you get your answer?
Yeah, Chris has thankfully typed that, so I don't have to try and pronounce it. So that's good.
Okay, perfect. Adam, you were wondering how many lumens are the lights that are used for the video and the images?
Yeah, I don't know actually. They don't tell you the lumen value for the fire dive gear lights or the light in motion. I think they give you a wattage or something for the lights. Can't remember exactly what they are. So sorry, I can't tell you how many lumens the lights are.
Yeah, no worries. I feel like we've gone all biological and now physics on you. So sorry about that.
Oh, sorry. Vera was wondering who it was to follow for the nudibranchs on Instagram.
Alistair Odell.
Oh, thank you. Oh, hello.
Yeah. There's more questions coming, but I just maybe if you ask, unmute yourselves and ask. And
sorry, did I miss a question?
We've one from Chris Rickard there, who has tried it a few times but struggling to get anything in focus. How do you manage?
That's probably thanks to my camera. I don't know. Yeah, I think it's just having the having the brightest lights definitely helps more, and having the settings so that the exposure is quite bright. It certainly helps.
There's also a question that Henrietta, I was actually wondering the same. How safe are the short wavelengths and the intensity of the lights for the species that have eyes? I would maybe extend that. How safe is using UV torches, especially in comparison with just conventional scuba diving torches for specific taxons? Taxa.
Well, these lights aren't UV; they're more blue, so they're not quite in the UV range. So I don't think that they're dangerous for us or other species, and most of the time other species that aren't any more bothered by the blue lights as they are from bright white lights. So I don't think that they're any different to using the white lights.
Okay.
I mean, UV light would be different, but these aren't UV.
Yeah, I guess you would be the first to notice if there is a difference, since there's not that much done in this specific sector of UV photography underwater. Where else? Well, there's questions coming in. What is the best time of the day? Does flash help? Molly asks.
Ideally, it should be dark for trying to capture fluorescence. There are corals and other tropical species that you can see fluorescence during the day, but for most of these species that we're trying to capture, yeah, the darker the better, really. So either at night, yeah, or a really dull day, little ambient light as possible. A flash would help. A flash would always give you a brighter light than a video light would. It depends on the image that you want to capture. If you want to, I like using the LED lights because I like the option of taking video as well, rather than being stuck to just a strobe for taking images.
And then, sorry, I missed Ian's question. Is it known where the luminescence originates from? Is it from the animals themselves, or is it from organisms that are coating the animals?
I think it's the animals themselves. Maybe not in all cases. I think with snake blocks and enemies, it could be partly due to the algae that lives within them as well, similar to corals, I guess. The work David Gruber and the other group in America did, they found that it was in the shark's skin and the denticles, and they even identified some of the compounds that was responsible for the fluorescence, but it was in the animal itself.
Okay, thank you. Don't be shy, guys. You can unmute yourselves and ask.
Question there from Robin. Do the blue lights work for night rock pooling? Yes, definitely. I do. Especially for things like snake blocks and enemies and beadlet and enemies. You can certainly see the fluorescence with the blue lights in rock pools at night.
We've done some with Ulster Wildlife, some night surveys like that, rock pooling, and we only really, the most exciting thing was definitely the snake logs anemone.
Yeah, they're really bright.
I didn't realize the beadlet one, and some shells. I think it was top shells. They appear like different colors, but it wasn't nearly as exciting as what you're presenting. I guess it's down to the gear at the end of the day.
UV lights work well for snake locks and enemies. They're quite handy for rock pooling. You don't really need to use a yellow barrier filter as well. You can just have a UV light. So they're good for that.
Hi, James. Is there any so when obviously you're operating in the dark most of the time, you know, because it's a night dive and so on. Is there any difference in the focusing light that you use between normal photography and fluoro photography?
Well, when I'm taking pictures for the fluoro stuff, I'm just using the blue lights to focus with.
Okay.
So I generally don't use the strobe with the strobe filter, to be honest. Most of the time I just use the blue lights by themselves.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So you're not using focusing lights at all. Yeah.
No, no.
Hi, James. If you had to give a top 3 things to remember for people that have never done this before and they're going to go and get the kit and they're going to go and have a go, what were your biggest obstacles? What do you wish you'd knew before you started that you'd advise a beginner on?
A decent camera, so a camera that's good at low light, and you can take images with a higher ISO without having too much noise. So even though I use the Canon compact, it is really good for that sort of thing. Having a bright lights, definitely. And I think a third one. Yeah, decent camera, good bright lights. I think that's pretty
I'll say a third one for you, James.
Go on then.
Hi, Chris Rickard here.
Hi, Chris.
Take it in a dive that you know the site really well for your first
Yeah.
couple of dives, because
Yeah.
it's such, you'll know yourself, it's such a task loading experience, like photography on its own. But using this stuff, man, I was struggling, and I was glad I was on a dive site that I knew reasonably well.
That's a good tip. So yeah, try it on a site that you kind of know what you're going to find, and some sort of subjects in mind, and somewhere that you know, and you know where to find them. Yeah, and always take a white light for navigating as well. You can't see much by the blue lights, especially if it's dark. And if you're using a mask filter as well, then you can't really see anything. So you definitely need a white light to help you find your way.
That's great, guys. Thank you.
Oh, a lot of questions are coming up. So did we go through the blue light torch you'd recommend? I think we might have one way or another. But if there's anything you want to add, that would be great.
I think the light and motion solar night sea lights are probably the brightest that I have. Although the fire dive gear lights are really good as well. It's between the two. If it's for just starting off to have a look, then the light and motion Gobi light is a good one. It's a bit cheaper, and you can get the night sea head for that. And it's a really good bright spotting light for finding things. But for taking good video and images, you need the brighter light.
I'm just wondering, James, would it be possible that instead of us asking you the technical questions now, if we maybe forward you a few questions from the group later on about, what kind of gear you would use this for people that haven't tried this before?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. Yeah.
Unless you want, I feel like you're probably going to receive a lot of questions directly, so I'm just trying to spare you that.
That's
but
okay.
yeah,
I don't mind answering them. If there's any I've missed.
Okay.
Hi, James. Can I ask? Oh, it's Lynn here. Can I ask? I've got a Canon G7X Mark II.
Okay.
I dropped out of signal a bit earlier. I wasn't sure if what protective case that you could advise.
I used the fantasy housing for that camera, and actually the one I had, because I got it years ago, it was before they added the vacuum sort of feature to it as well. But I used that for about 6 years, and it never had a drop of water inside it. It was a great housing, and it has every camera function, all the buttons accessible, and it has the threaded port as well for lenses and filters. So I definitely recommend the fantasy housings for that camera.
Great, thanks.
There's a couple more questions in the chat. So Henrietta has having some trouble with the sound. So she's asking, I'm just going to read the questions. I think I remember being told flashlight fish host luminous bacteria. So I don't know if you know.
Is that bioluminescence rather than fluorescence?
Yeah, I think it might be, but I'm not sure. Molly asks, attracting prey. Molly, did you mean while taking the photography, or in general, whether they have that kind of pattern to attract prey. Molly might not be able to hear us.
It was maybe a reason for them, fluorescing, I would guess.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Guess
I
it
guess.
depends.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Not too sure, to be honest. I don't think anybody is really sure.
Let's see what else. Adam asks if we have any larger filter feeders like sponges, and that they have tried calcine here in British Columbia to try and demonstrate the water pumping action of glass sponges.
I don't think we have. Well, we do have sponges, but I don't think anything quite on the large scale that they might be talking about.
Well, I mean, we do have sponges, of course,
Yeah.
and glass sponges as well, but I'm not quite sure if how relevant this is to the fluorescence aspect of it. Maybe they were using fluorescence to sort of pick up the water movement, but
I think so. That's what it sounds like.
yeah.
Sarah asks, do you know the wavelength of the yellow barrier filters? Just because she's thinking of potentially buying one, I guess.
Yeah, most of the companies won't tell you what the specific color of the plastic or glass that they use for the filters. You can use, so as a replacement for the night sea filter, I use a gel filter, which you can buy, and it's a certain color. So I'll just type it in the chat. So Lee, what's it, 101, I think is the color. And you can buy the gel pretty cheaply, and then just cut circles out and stick it into, you can buy really cheap threaded stepping rings and then make your own filters. Just type that in the chat.
It'd be good for people to get started anyway.
Whoa, there's a lot of questions. Well, we have another 10 minutes. Are you happy enough?
Yeah, we can have 10.
Yeah,
Yeah,
fine.
I think the meeting ends anyway. So yeah, we can do another 10 minutes.
Right, well, where did we stop? Vera asked, could it be easier to find fluorescence to not dive with white light? Oh, it's already been answered apparently. Okay, I'm gonna move on to Peter. Who, sorry, James, you want to say something?
No, I'm saying okay, that's fine.
Peter asks, what ISO are you typically using, and what is the limitation of the camera you're using?
It depends on the subject. Things like the cup corals and light bulb tunicates, I could use ISO as low as 125 or sort of around 125 or 200. I guess that sometimes it does depend on if I'm using the macro wet lenses, which means I have to use a very small aperture. So then I might use a slightly higher ISO just to be able to use a smaller aperture to get a decent depth of field with that lens. But generally around 400-ish, I would say, probably on average. I try not to go higher than, or even try not to go up to 640. With the camera, it can get quite noisy up there. So yeah, but 400 to 500 is kind of the maximum that I would for with that camera.
Thank you so much. Unless I've missed something, I think those are all the questions in the chat.
Okay.
Does anybody have any more questions?
Can I ask another one?
One per day. No, I'm kidding.
All right. No, I was going to ask you, James. Is there much in the literature about fluorescence and well, I'm thinking of the ecology of fluorescence, really. You know, speculation or experimentation as to finding out what its function might be, or is the sort of, I guess, recent sort of interest in fluorescence, such as from people like you taking photos and putting them up, is that sort of displaying, sort of triggering any increase in research on fluorescence and the reasons for it?
Yeah, I'm not too sure, to be honest. I haven't looked for a while. I know there was some work with certainly the group in America were looking at the reasons as to why the cat sharks would fluoresce. And I know that there had been work done on corals where the proteins responsible for fluorescence had some sort of almost like a sunblock or protectant effect. I'm not quite sure how far that got or whether that was actually proven or not. I'm not aware of any sort of literature or research that's been kind of triggered by sort of pictures I've been posting or not, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
We've got a couple from Lynn. What's your favourite shore site? And was that a flapper skate at the end?
Unfortunately, it wasn't a flapper skate. I've never seen a flapper skate. Chris is the person that speaks about flapper skates, definitely. No, all the fluorescent skates in that talk were thornbacks. Favorite shore dive site is probably the Falls of Laura near Oban. If anyone's not familiar with that, it's a very, very tidal site where it has to be done at slack water, and the underwater topography and marine life is just amazing there. So it's definitely my favorite shore dive site.
You do that at night?
I have done it at night once a few years ago. That was interesting. I was actually hoping that the Dahlia and then, which is why I did that at night, but it didn't, unfortunately. That would have been quite nice. But,
yeah. Finn, yes, I'll send out a link, and once I get the recording downloaded, I can send everyone a link to the talk. There's a few people who weren't able to attend, which I'm going to share it with, so I can certainly send it to everyone if people want a copy. And anyone signed up on Eventbrite will get it. If you didn't sign up via Eventbrite, email the Seasearch NI at gmail.com and I'll send you a copy of the talk. But I think if everyone has got other questions, if there's anything anybody wants to ask, you can certainly email, and we can send a collaboration to James with a whole list of questions. If there's any more, we can circulate that around everyone as well.
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer any other questions that you want to send.
Yeah. I think that's all. Thank you very much, James. That was brilliant, and it was great to see. It was great to see all of those. There was stuff I didn't know that fluoresced in there, definitely. And I've been following all your photos for a while, so there was some in there I hadn't seen still. So it was really, really good. Really enjoyed it. Really interesting, and thanks very much for talking to us all.
For inviting me along. It's been great. It's great to see so much interest.
Yeah. No, it was definitely a popular talk, and there's loads of nice messages coming in on the chat there for you. So I'll not read them all out, but you can have a wee scroll through.
Thanks very much, everybody. Great. Just looking at the
Thank you, James.
That was brilliant. Thanks very much indeed. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for attending as well. I'll send out a wee link to the recording. Apparently they take a while to download, so it'll probably be over the weekend, but I'll certainly send that out so you can all watch it again and have a look. And definitely check out James on Instagram. He's got loads of great photos.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Brilliant.
Okay,
Thank
cheers.
you very much.
Bye,
Thank you, James.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye.
It's kind of hard to keep up when everybody starts sleeping.
I know, I hope I didn't miss any. I don't think I missed any. I think there was just a couple at the end.
Well, I think the Zoom chat saves as well, so we can, go through it again maybe later on. And
oh yeah, I just stopped the recording.